Hi, everybody. I'm Fred Cunningham, and welcome to Fred the Show. And fortunately, it's not Fred the Musical. Thanks for joining us here on WSPA Plus. We are having a really fun event for you here for our first episode of our show, because we're talking about something that's great this time of year, and that's the opportunity to get out of the heat and go to your local movie theater. And do we have the perfect guest to bring in to talk about where movies have been, where they are now, and where they might be going? I'm joined by Stephen J. Rubin, who is a producer, a screenwriter, an author, a podcaster. He's also a film historian, and he joins us today from Los Angeles. Stephen, thanks for being with me today.
Fred, I'm starting your show. What an honor.
It's great to have you with me. I've got to tell you, I want to talk a little bit about your background later, but I can tell you that you've written 2 books on the James Bond films. You're probably the number one source for the history of Bond. The James Bond films, a behind-the-scenes history, the James Bond movie encyclopedia, with 4 combined new versions of those to keep up with the movies. I read your book in 1981 when it came out, and this is before Entertainment Tonight. This is before USA Today. It's probably the first piece I ever read about how movies are made in the background stories.
You know, I decided to write that book because no one had done a behind-the-scenes history of the James Bond franchise. And for those of us who grew up in the 60s, that was the Avengers Marvel universe of its day. I mean, a new Bond movie, we used to get them every other year or even every year. It was crazy.
It was great stuff. We're going to talk about Bond before we go. But first of all, let's talk about what's going on, not in the movies at this moment, but a big occasion that's just come and gone. Jaws opened in theaters 50 years ago, was officially last week. In today's movie climate, is there any kind of a film that could make an entire country, for instance, think twice about going swimming in the ocean for a couple of years?
Well, you know, Jaws was revolutionary for many reasons. It was the first movie that really opened wide with television advertising. I mean, everybody knew about Jaws because it was based on that wonderful Peter Benchley summer reading book that had been released the previous year, directed by a very young Steven Spielberg, starring Roy Scheider and Richard Dreyfuss and Robert Shaw, who, of course, was in a James Bond movie, From Russia with Love. And I think it was just a very unique movie. At its core, Jaws was a horror movie, except without zombies or vampires. They had the shark. And it's interesting in studying its behind-the-scenes history, and we recently had an interview with Carl Gottlieb, who wrote the screenplay. We learned a lot about how tough that shoot was. The shark didn't work very well. We've heard about Bruce the Shark for years. And because it didn't work well, they decided not to show it much, which actually added to the horrific effect of the movie. If they had shown the shark more, I don't think people would have been scared. It's akin to Alien. If you recall the original Ridley Scott Alien, which was released 4 years later, you barely see the alien, and it's creepy. I think the adage in Hollywood is the less you see, the scarier it becomes.
And it made your mind really work and create that frightening aspects much more than if you had just seen this mechanical shark. I know we could do 2 hours on the making of the movie, but just it was Spielberg going to his Hitchcock, wasn't it, to really make this movie work?
It was, and I think that the hallmark of Steven Spielberg's filmmaking skills is he gets you right in the water with the bathers. You know, he's the guy. He showed it years later with Saving Private Ryan, when the guys are coming out of the water in Omaha Beach and you're following Tom Hanks. He has the camera right in the water, and those bathers on that beach off Martha's Vineyard, the camera's right in the water, so you don't have any place to hide. And it's scary. Even there were some red herrings. There really wasn't a shark out there for a while. It's scary. It was scary. It's akin to a movie that was released 2 years earlier, The Exorcist, the Billy Friedkin movie, where you also were really scared by what you were seeing. But Spielberg launched the summer movie craze. From 1975 on, the studios realized they could make a bundle of money by showing event movies like Jaws.
And that's really one of the things I wanted to get to you about. It really did invent the summer movie season. And where do you think we are today after now 50 years of seeing just every weekend, once you get to about the first or second week of May, is just loaded with something big waiting for your local theater?
We're in the era of the franchise movie. It's very hard in Hollywood, and I'm out there every day trying to sell movies. I'm a comedy writer. Comedy has almost virtually disappeared from the cinema, but everybody in the studios wants to have a guaranteed hit. And of course, there's no guarantees. But if they do they do Iron Man 4 or Superman 5 or Batman 6 or Avengers this, they have a certain dynamic that guarantees that if they spend this amount of money, they'll get this amount of money. It's no longer a seat of the pants business where these studio executives have to kind of hope that something will hit. They fortify these event movies. That's why all we're seeing these days are remakes, reboots, sequels, prequels. Occasionally you get an Oppenheimer, something a little fresh. We get a Barbie,
Yeah.
but even Barbie's going to be a franchise. There'll be another Barbie movie. Wicked has the sequel coming up in the fall. It's hard to be an original filmmaker in Hollywood right now. My theory is that these marketing departments that are spending tens of millions of dollars to put the ads on your TV or your computer, they want to have a pre-marketed quantity so they don't have to introduce something new. Now, there's a movie that opened this past weekend, the latest Pixar movie. I think it's called Elio or something like that.
Right.
And it didn't do very well because it was an original. Now, eventually, it'll probably get an audience, but they want pre-marketable titles. There's a new Superman movie coming out. They're even doing a new Naked Gun movie with Liam Neeson in the old Leslie Nielsen role. So what is old is new again.
It is odd, but at the same time, and you mentioned it, there's no sure things. And you mentioned about these big event movies. Variety, I read yesterday, did a breakdown of where they think the 2025 releases are as far as their profitability, box office versus the amount of money it costs to make them. Mission Impossible: Final Reckoning. I saw it. It's a thrill ride. I really enjoyed it. A $400 million budget. It's made $540 million. Can you explain how that's a money loser?
Well, when you hear about box office gross, you hear the movie did 550. The studio only gets half of that. So they'll get 275. If the movie costs 400 million, you're in a deep hole right now. Interestingly, the movie that was playing up against Lilo and Stitch, I think, has grossed over $1 billion on a $200 million budget. Hollywood movies have gotten to be way too expensive. For $400 million, I could make 20 modestly budgeted comedies.
Yeah.
I think that because there's so much digital effects work involved, and combining that with Tom Cruise's prowess to do these physical stunts, which are beyond anybody's crazy acumen, it costs money. They pour a lot of money into that. I don't know how long Hollywood can sustain that, but they are making money. I mean, Mission Impossible, through all the ancillary rights, will eventually make its money back. But I think Hollywood movies are too expensive.
And they're expensive to go to see. So you're asking a lot for people to invest their hard-earned money to go and see something that they hope that's going to be a lot of fun to watch. And at the same time, you had a podcast recently that was about television. And you talked about Desi Arnaz, who, and I didn't really realize it till the way you put it, was really one of the people who created what television became, what primetime network television became. And primetime TV was considered to be a threat to the movie theaters. But you also made the point that movie theaters have always been under some kind of threat, whether it be TV, Blockbuster, and now streaming.
Yeah, it's. I still maintain that for the right movie, people like to watch the movies in a crowd. Now, there are the purists. If somebody lights up a phone next to you or starts coughing behind you, they freak out. But particularly for me with comedies, but when you see a big adventure film like Mission Impossible, where you're on a thrill ride, it's like a roller coaster. It's fun to see it on the big screen. I know our TV screens have gotten bigger. You know, we've got the surround sound now. You don't have to walk too far to go to the bathroom. But I still think that movie theaters are the place to see big movies. I'm sure you saw that at the beginning of Mission Impossible, Tom Cruise comes on the screen and thanks you for coming to the movie theater.
Yeah.
I think we'll always have movie theaters. I think that for especially for younger generations, for the under 50s, you know, for those of us who are older, you know, enjoying a lot of these movies on our big screens is the way to go. But even older people went out to see Oppenheimer. You know, that was a nice twist. That was a big twist for them.
And at the same time, though, I did see another piece in Variety. It was a poll of U.S. exhibition executives, and 55% thought the traditional cinema experience to remain viable for business has less than 20 years left. That kind of scares me a little bit, but on the other hand, when I went to see Mission Impossible, I went with a group. Half of us saw Mission Impossible, half saw Lilo and Stitch, and it was hard to find a parking place, which I thought was great news.
I think people want, first of all, as a species, we're social people. You know, sometimes we don't want to sit alone at home or just with our family. Sometimes we want to get out and do something. I can't just sit at home all the time and watch movies. I want to get out to the cinema. So I think, and particularly young people, I've always kind of joked that young couples, you know, whatever their gender is, they like to be kind of cuddly in a movie theater as opposed onto the couch where mom and dad are in the background. So that, for that reason alone, young people like to go out to the movies. That's how the drive-in craze started back in the 50s. People still go to drive-ins. I'm sure they're still popular, particularly in the summer. But the concept of the quote-unquote passion pit still exists.
It is a fun shared experience. And I can remember moments from average movies. I remember I was 10 years old when I saw Airport, and it was a full house. And when George Kennedy drives the stuck plane out, it was like a standing ovation. And you don't get that from watching that at home.
No. And you're talking about one of my all-time favorite movies. I mean, Airport. And that was a throwback. If people recall that as the 70s began, and that was released in 1970, Hollywood went to kind of smaller, more intimate and edgy movies like Five Easy Pieces and Easy Rider. And Ross Hunter, the producer of Airport, brought a big Hollywood splashy cast together. And that was a throwback to the big Hollywood movies of yore. We don't see those as much anymore, but when you put a big cast like that together, it's pretty impressive. I think Quentin Tarantino in his movies realizes the value of putting together a cool cast.
Well, and he's got some great event movies as well. We've got much more to come talking with Stephen J. Rubin. When we come back in just a moment, we're going to talk a little bit about him, but also one of his favorite subjects. It's one of my favorite as well. What's the future of James Bond? That's straight ahead on Fred the Show. And we are back now on Fred the Show. This is where an episode we're calling Attack of the Summer Movies. And I'm joined once again by Stephen J. Rubin. First of all, tell me just a little bit. I want to pop your website up so people can take a look at that. Let's get a close look at that. StephenJRubin.com, .com to find out everything. But tell me a little bit about some of the work that you've done. And you've got two outstanding podcasts that I'm a regular listener of.
Yes, Stephen J. Rubin, Saturday Night at the Movies. We interview people on both sides of the camera. We've done over 150 episodes, talked to some amazing people. I talked to Paul Anka. I've talked to Nancy Olson, who was in the original Sunset Boulevard. I've talked to so many people. And then in my other podcast, I do with two producers, Julian Schlossberg and Arthur E. Friedman. It's called Tales from Hollywoodland. I'm having a lot of fun. I started my career right after college. I went to UCLA, studied history and journalism, And I was researching the history of great movies, the ones we loved when we were growing up. I particularly liked the 1950s science fiction films like The Day the Earth Stood Still, Forbidden Planet, The Blob, Them, War of the Worlds. And I got a lot of interest in my writing because I went to the sources. I interviewed people who actually worked on the movie. I didn't write something based on 10 other writers. So I've enjoyed that very much. And these podcasts have brought back the thrill of talking to the actual participants. And it's been a lot of fun. And then I have, opportunities sometimes. Marcia Clark, who's well known as the lead prosecutor on the O.J. Simpson case, has written a book exposing the Barbara Graham case, which inspired a 1958 movie that won Susan Hayward the Oscar that year for Best Actress, a movie called I Want to Live. And her book, Trial by Ambush, which I recommend to anybody, is an expose of what they were doing back on the 50s to railroad people. And they eventually executed Barbara Graham, and she didn't need to be executed. So those kind of stories I find very interesting. And then, of course, James Bond. I featured an old interview I did with Albert R. Broccoli, Cubby Broccoli, and people just loved hearing him talk about how his life began.
Well, let's go to that right now because it's as good a time as any to talk about James Bond. And right now, the future is something that it's in a flux right now. And if you're a Bond fan like we both are, it's kind of interesting to see what might be transpiring here over the next couple of years, kind of break down for our viewers how there's been a handoff of sorts between the original producers and where they are now.
Yes, as many of you know, Amazon bought the MGM library a few years ago, but they were having trouble kickstarting the Bond series. So they realized that the creative producers at that time, Barbara Broccoli, who was the daughter of Cubby Broccoli, and her stepbrother, Michael Wilson, just were too slow for them. So they spent a lot of money to get the creative ability to make Bond movies. So for the first time since 1962, we're talking 63 years, the Bond series is not in the hands of the Broccoli family. Amazon is in control. I think one of the producers was involved in the Harry Potter series. They're going to start casting soon. The big question, of course, is who is the next James Bond? That is the $64,000 question. Basically, I did a podcast last week with Graham Rye. He's the editor of 007 magazine in London. We spent an hour talking about all the candidates. Here's a name you may hear shortly. He's a Scottish actor. I'd never heard of him, but his name is Stuart Martin. Stuart Martin may have the grit to be James Bond. Now, last year, the newspapers in London said that Aaron Taylor Johnson would be the next James Bond. He's also a candidate. Some people like Henry Cavill, but Henry Cavill is very much associated with other film franchises like The Man from U.N.C.L.E. and Superman. So I don't think that my theory about the new James Bond is there should be a little mystery about them. When Daniel Craig became Bond in 2006, none of us knew who he was. He was disparagingly referred to as that blonde Bond, and yet he was wonderful. If you saw the first Daniel Craig James Bond movie, Casino Royale, he was jaw-droppingly great, and he continued being great in all the subsequent films. So I think Bond is very much alive. I always joke that there are three things certain in life: death, taxes, and James Bond movies.
That's probably true. Let me ask you one more Bond-oriented question. What do you think might be the direction? Because it looks like they've always based the movies sort of on the characterization by the actor. That Roger Moore was more comfortable with a lighter kind of movie that maybe fit into the 1970s. Timothy Dalton tried to go hard in the 80s, and I don't think people liked it. Daniel Craig charted the same course in the 2000s, and as you mentioned, he was superb.
You know, it is an interesting question. You could never do the Roger Moore films today. The world has become a much darker place. And I think that Bond has to be a hero for the ages. And we're living in an era of international terrorism. All of the Daniel Craig movies were almost focused on international terrorism. There was a lot of a lot of effort to make the story fresh. One of the problems facing the Bond movies these days is competition. Back in '62, when Dr. No debuted, there was no competition. Now you've got Mission Impossible, you got John Wick, you've got The Fast and the Furious, you've got The Kingsman, you've got, and they make an occasional Jason Bourne movie. All of these movies steal a page from James Bond. In fact, watching the latest Mission Impossible, a lot of that action reminded me of a James Bond movie. So to be fresh is a great challenge for these filmmakers who have the mantle of creating the new Bond movie.
Well, we got just a few minutes left, and I want to get back to some of the things you were talking about with contemporary movies. You mentioned you're a comedy writer. Where are movie comedies? It looks like if you want to find them, they're on Netflix, or they're made for Netflix, or they are made for the streaming services.
You know, there's kind of a little bit of a rebellion going on right now. Things have gotten too comedies have gotten too polite, and the key to good comedy is just being a disruptor. I mean, think of the first Airplane movie back in '80. I mean, you got to be outrageous as much as possible. So I'm hoping that the outrageous comedies will come back. As I mentioned, Liam Neeson is in the new Naked Gun movie. I'm holding out for that. But I think that one of the things that will pull people back to the cinemas are good comedies. Because my goodness, we need to laugh today. We definitely need to laugh. It's a catharsis. It's actually healthy. So we got to laugh. And I'm pumping out comedies every day, trying to figure out a way to get them sold. And you're going to hear from me because these comedies are too good to pass up.
I like hearing that. I mentioned some of your work in just to draw something else. They made a movie out of it, but you also wrote the Twilight Zone encyclopedia.
Yes, the original Twilight Zone, the first 5 seasons back in '59 to '64. Yes, that was a labor of love. I got to know Rod Serling's widow, Carol, very well. She opened the filing cabinets to me. My book, The Twilight Zone Encyclopedia, is available on Amazon with my James Bond movie encyclopedia, and had a lot of fun tracking down every survivor I could find who worked on the original series. And it's in black and white, and I maintain that part of the reason the reboots have not worked is because they're in color. You can't do The Twilight Zone in color. You got to do it in original black and white.
That is superb stuff. By the way, romantic comedies, I think, are also hanging out with comedies as far as just, not being on the big studio radar.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's true. You'll find them on the streamers. Occasionally, I think romance has disappeared from the multiplex for now, but I'm hoping it will make a comeback.
In our final minutes here, what do you think is ahead? I look out there right now. I looked back 40 years ago to the movies that came out in '85. Yeah, there were sequels then. There was a Rambo. There was a second Back to the Future. There was a Bond movie that year. It just seemed that there were a lot more original movies out there that tried to get it. And at the same time, we were just talking about a new movie, Elio, that came out last weekend that pretty much flopped.
Got to be careful with titles. I have personal experience. I was working at Columbia Pictures back in the '80s, in '83 actually, and they released a really fun fantasy movie called Krull, Krull, with a dynamite James Horner score. It was kind of a science fiction fantasy. I don't think anybody went to see it. They didn't know what a Krull was. Even a movie like The Shawshank Redemption, which we all love, it's one of the great movies of all time, did not benefit from a title that didn't flow trippingly from the tongue. But I think the future, I think that there are a lot of filmmakers in Hollywood trying to get new stuff out there. I think the studios will continue to run with franchises, but my great hope is that we can get some originals out there that aren't that expensive. For instance, Mission Impossible, $400 million. I don't need $400 million to produce a great comedy. I can do one for 10. That means I could do 40 movies. So I think that the studios just need to be approached by people like me who can give them bargains that can fill seats.
I think that's a great idea. Very, very quickly, this is an unfair question to ask. I got about a minute left. we've seen the DVD sales pretty much disappear because everyone goes straight to streaming. Does that kill the chance for a movie to become a cult classic like Shawshank?
It's a very good question. I think that people discover movies in different ways. Sometimes they watch them on their phone. Word of mouth does prevail. So whatever the medium, I think streaming does have word of mouth. People hear about things. I think there's too much in streaming. I mean, I think a couple years ago they said there were 587 scripted series. I'm a big TV watcher. I watch maybe 5 shows. So it's just a too crowded universe. It really is. I think they just have to cull it down, which they're trying to do.
You can't get to everything. Stephen J. Rubin, thank you for being with me today. It was a great way to kick off Attack of the Summer Movies, and thank you for joining me on Fred the Show today.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Fred, and I look forward to your show being a big hit.
Very, very good. Thank you so much, Stephen. You have a great day, and thank you for joining me on Fred the Show. We will see you next time right here on WSPA+.